Após a Idade das Trevas, a Itália iluminou o mundo. Emergiu da sinistra e devastadora peste negra e trouxe inovações, arte e a glorificação do homem. Foi uma explosão de ideias brotadas das mentes mais esclarecidas de todos os tempos.
Filippo Brunelleschi was the ingenio, the ingenious man.
Ali nasceram algumas das maiores obras de arquitetura, arte e engenharia que o mundo já conheceu.
The enterprise of Renaissance engineering is recovering this ancient knowledge.
I don't think that any other period in the history of Western civilization can brag to having produced so much genius.
Mas chegar a gênio era uma luta. Os construtores enfrentaram desastres naturais sem precedentes, os dogmas da igreja e os rivais.
And the Italian peninsula becomes the cockpit, the fighting point.
Essa foi a era dos arquitetos, a qual criou a gratificante sensação de que nada era impossível. Construindo um Império. O mundo de Da Vinci. Ano 476 depois de Cristo. O grande Império Romano desabara e sepultara para sempre seu poder e domínio. Os imperadores que unificaram a região já não existiam e a Europa Ocidental fragmentara-se. Durante séculos, a Europa foi governada por uma linha de reis germânicos que chamaram seus domínios de Sacro Império Romano. Mas no século XII começou a surgir uma coleção de repúblicas italianas. Unidas, elas decidiram resgatar as glórias da velha Roma. Revitalizaram a Europa e criaram o molde do mundo ocidental.
Hi, I'm Peter Weller. And in 2001, I came here to the city of Florence to finish a master's degree in Italian Renaissance art history at Syracuse University in Florence. The Italian Renaissance is as overwhelmingly mind-blowing as it is beautiful. It is the most impacting epoch of the last millennium. It is the age of invention with Da Vinci and Copernicus and Gutenberg. But it is also the age of the cult of personality. It is the time when that unknown artisan or craftsman will become the artist. It is the time when that nameless builder will become the architect.
In the 12th and 13th centuries, Italy is really beginning this sort of rebirth. Because what's happening is that stability has been reinstituted onto the peninsula, mainly through the Holy Roman Empire, through the system that we call feudalism. The city is reborn.
E nessas liberais cidades romanas surgiu novo tipo de líder.
The rulers of the Italian city-states are the merchants. They're not the traditional aristocracy. They're not the traditional nobles. And this produces this extraordinarily vibrant urban life in the 13th century.
Famílias como os Médici dirigiram bancos tanto quanto governavam cidades. A riqueza gerava poder. E o poder podia comprar arte e arquitetura. As cidades começaram a construir em grande escala, sempre de olho no vizinho e ciosas da própria independência.
The foundation for the Renaissance is the city. Everything that happens in the Renaissance, from art, architecture, engineering, literature, all the things that go on depend upon the city.
Uma ambiciosa cidade que buscava o poder era uma república florescente situada ao longo de uma importante rota de comércio entre a França e Roma. Seu nome era Siena.
I come here to the Piazza del Campo once a year to witness that medieval harangue on horseback around here called Palio. 3 times around this Campo, 90 seconds of speed and violence on bareback horses. When the horses run, they pass this magnificent 15th century sculpted fountain called the Fonte Gaia by Jacopo della Quercia. Now today, when we turn on a tap, we just take it for granted that H2O is going to come out. But the Sienese needed this fountain because when they were making all this loot, prosperity begets a city jam-packed with people. And more people demands, as we have seen with Persia, with Carthage, with Rome, with the Maya, more water.
Mas prover essa cidade de água suficiente era desafio complicado.
Siena doesn't have a river very close, so they had to find this water somewhere else. They thought they could find another way to go and search for water, and that way was building some tunnels underground.
Escavando uma rede de túneis subterrâneos, chamados bottini, os engenheiros chegaram a fontes naturais e lençóis de água que havia na periferia. Aos poucos, a água chegava a esses túneis muito estreitos que acabavam em tanques. Mas escavar esses bottini não era fácil. Eles usavam pás e picaretas para remover os depósitos de calcita em túneis de poucos centímetros de altura, escuros, poeirentos e insalubres.
A bottino like this one would sometimes run for miles and miles, so the engineers had to know just where in the heck they were going. So every so often they dug a hole up to the surface, and these holes were called occhi, or eyes. It would give the engineer a sense of where the direction of the bottino would be, and if they were wrong, they could redirect the bottino.
A água corria pelos túneis, distribuindo-se pelas regiões mais necessitadas, e ainda alimentavam as fontes das ruas e avenidas movimentadas como a Fonte Gaia.
Now these channels had to be pitched at an angle ever so slight, imperceptible to the naked eye, less than 1 degree, because if the water flowed too steeply, it would overwhelm the system. So to keep this from happening, the engineers used an instrument called an archipendolo. It's nothing but a pendulum. It's a stick with a string and a weighted ball or stone at the end. No matter how much you pitch the stick, the string will always remain vertical, giving you a vertical line in a relationship to the tilt of the horizontal stick. In this way, the water would flow quietly and evenly into Siena and fill up the Fonte Gaia.
Em 1345, mais de 15 quilômetros de túneis cortavam o subterrâneo de Siena. E assim a cidade cresceu e prosperou.
More water brought more people to the boomtown. More people to the boomtown, more turf is needed. Pretty soon, Siena controls most of southern Tuscany. Now, this prosperity and this land encroachment, if you will, would seriously become the burr in the saddle to one of its neighbors.
Florence and Siena are the two dominant republics in Tuscany.
It was a rivalry on all levels. Economic, political, artistically. And in the 13th century, the city-state of Siena, in all three of these categories, was probably Florence's superior.
As duas repúblicas seguiam ombro a ombro até que Siena obteve vitória esmagadora na Batalha de Montaperte em 1260.
Siena fights Florence. To put it bluntly, Siena kicks ass. Florence goes home in humiliation and defeat, but guess what? That ain't gonna be for long.
A soberba engenharia que tornara Siena tão atraente, nada pôde fazer diante de dos piores desastres que o mundo já viu.
1347, the Black Death struck. And according to the eminent humanist writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the Black Death, the disease killed so fast that you could lunch with your friends and dine with your ancestors in heaven. One conservative estimate is that Siena lost over 60% of its population in a matter of months. One thing is for certain, after the Black Death, Siena would never be a major player again on the stage of early modern Italy.
That singular event probably marks the end of Siena's role on a kind of international scene, and it also marks the beginning of Florence's rise to power.
Siena fora mortalmente atingida e deixou a porta aberta para sua arquirrival Florença tomar-lhe o lugar e começar a escalada rumo ao poder e à glória. Lá foi construído um dos mais magníficos monumentos da modernidade, algo que ninguém havia sonhado construir. Nos séculos 13 e 14, as cidades eram centros de poder na Itália. Mas Florença criou um estilo único. A elite dominante florescia rica e culta. O homem e seu potencial ilimitado ocuparam o centro do palco. A revolucionária ideia chamou-se humanismo.
Humanism, quite simply, is an interest in the ancient world. In Italy, all you had to do was look around at the ancient ruins and understand how great man had been in the ancient world. It was all there. If we could imitate that building, if we could take the principles of that building and apply it to our buildings, then we'd have something really remarkable.
Quando a peste negra atingiu a Europa em 1347, Florença não saiu ilesa. Praticamente metade da população foi dizimada. Toda a região levaria mais de 50 anos para se reerguer. Mas seria uma recuperação que assombraria o mundo. Chamou-se Renascença, que significa novo nascimento ou revivência. Por toda a Toscana, uma elite privilegiada de famílias abastadas começou a encomendar projetos grandiosos a artistas vindos do povo.
There is an appetite among those who survive to enjoy life, to do other things, to understand or to sense that the life is to be exploited in some way for those who are alive.
Os Médicis de Florença, uma das famílias mais ricas da Itália, liderou o resgate da glória de Roma, restaurando-a em Florença e transformando a cidade em uma nova Atenas.
The structure of patronage has changed. Patrons are using artists and architects to celebrate themselves.
O exemplo central desse esforço seria a catedral, no coração de Florença.
They've never seen a structure that looks like the one they want to build. Right? That's a matter of ambition, of idea.
See that big old church behind me with that scaffolding on it? It's called Santa Maria del Fiore, otherwise known as the Duomo, or Cathedral of Florence. It was built by a guy named Arnolfo da Cambio around 1200s, but you know what? He was dead before it was ever finished. Arnolfo intended for the church to have a dome, but he's dead, so the church stands for a whole bunch of decades without any dome on it at all. Finally, in the 1400s, it's left up to a guy wearing a real genius suit named Filippo Brunelleschi to not only change the entire idea of building to become an architect, but to make the entire field of architecture a design.
Brunelleschi vinha de uma família de classe média e devia se tornar funcionário do governo tal como o pai. Mas ele amava e admirava as artes e começou estudando ourivesaria.
It's only in his early 30s that he then moved over and began to become what we now call an architect.
Now, Brunelleschi is a maverick and he's brash. His dad is a notary. Brunelleschi wants to study sculpture. Wonder how his dad reacted to that one, huh? Probably like my old man reacted when I told him I wanted to go to New York and become an actor. In any case, by his early 20s, Brunelleschi is a pretty fair goldsmith. Now, in 1401, the baptistry decides it wants to replace its doors, so they hold a competition. Competition comes down to two guys, Brunelleschi and the international Gothic man of the hour, Lorenzo Ghiberti. Brunelleschi was pretty good, but he ain't no Ghiberti. Ghiberti wins. Brunelleschi runs away with his tail between his legs. humiliated in defeat.
He loses the competition to Ghiberti in 1401. And it sets up the kind of perfect opportunity for him to leave the city of Florence, then go to Rome and study the secrets of the ancients.
Brunelleschi deve ter passado quase 2 décadas em Roma, examinando as obras mais importantes da engenharia antiga.
Renaissance Italians are fascinated with the way Romans did everything, the way things were done in ancient Rome, and building is no exception. A big part of the enterprise of Renaissance engineering is recovering this ancient knowledge.
Uma obra em particular deve ter causado especial impacto em Brunelleschi: o Panteão. Teriam os romanos descoberto o modo de construí-lo sem as armações de apoio? Nessas 2 longas décadas, ele deve ter examinado cada centímetro do domo, cujo diâmetro ultrapassava os 40 metros, tentando desvendar o segredo de sua construção. Quando voltou a Florença, Brunelleschi certamente trazia consigo a chave do domo romano.
It seems that Brunelleschi reappears in Florence just at the time that the opera of the cathedral was in fact planning on this competition for the design of the dome. The cathedral was to be, upon completion, the largest church in all of Christianity.
A catedral seria um dos grandes desafios da engenharia italiana.
They were building it large to sort of show the world exactly how important this city was on all levels. The problem was that they were setting themselves up for a big fall.
Diferindo dos demais arquitetos, Brunelleschi propôs um método que o expôs ao ridículo. Projetou o domo sem os tradicionais arcobotantes, nem apoios de madeira, nem armação interna.
General public opinion was that Brunelleschi had gone very simply mad. They also began to realize that no one else seems to have any clearer picture of how to pull this thing off, and so they began gradually sort of heed his words.
Brunelleschi conseguiu seduzir os juízes com o projeto, mas para sua consternação, a comissão estipulou uma condição que ele julgou aviltante.
It seems that fate would rear its ugly head because he would have to share that role with his nemesis, Lorenzo Ghiberti.
Muitos estavam convencidos de que o projeto não daria certo. Brunelleschi não só teria de projetar o domo, como precisaria arquitetar a derrota do rival. A 7 de agosto de 1420, com o arquiteto supervisionando cada detalhe, finalmente teve início a construção do grande domo.
What Brunelleschi decides to do is to construct not one dome, but 2. Okay? A dome within a dome.
Dentro da catedral, os fiéis poderiam apreciar a belíssima decoração interna do domo. Por fora, entretanto, o segundo domo tinha propósito mais funcional.
He would use that second shell to protect the inner dome from rain, but at the same time to make the entire structure look more gonfia et magnifica, more swollen and magnificent.
Para dar às cúpulas uma base estrutural, nervuras de mármore foram instaladas em cada vértice do domo octogonal. A seguir, uma série de arcos foi construída para cruzar com as nervuras em ângulos de 90 graus. Mas Brunelleschi enfrentou um problema logístico. Achar um modo de içar várias toneladas de material a mais de 60 metros.
And so Brunelleschi devises something we call the ox hoist.
Atrelados a um timão, 2 bois faziam girar um pilar que erguia e baixava um guindaste. A marca do gênio estava numa rosca que mudava as engrenagens para a frente e para trás. Ou seja, os bois não precisavam ser desatrelados para trocar de lugar. Ficavam andando na mesma direção tanto para erguer quanto para baixar o guindaste, economizando horas diárias de trabalho. Nessa tarefa foram içadas mais de 30.000 toneladas de material. Apesar de todo esse trabalho, cada peça ainda precisava ser transportada lateralmente e colocada no ponto exato a dezenas de metros de altura. Para resolver esse problema aparentemente insolúvel, Brunelleschi projetou outro tipo de guindaste, chamado castelo.
The castello was a crane that they used to move weights horizontally.
Instalado no alto da cúpula e semelhante a um cavalete, tinha um sistema de trave mestra e contrapeso, permitindo a colocação do material com precisão milimétrica.
These are the machines that he was introducing, and these are the machines that made it possible for such a dome to have been built.
Mas toda essa criatividade ainda não resolvia o desafio fundamental de um domo desse tamanho sem nenhum apoio interno. Brunelleschi ainda precisava evitar um desmoronamento. A tarefa exigiu um grande salto de imaginação, combinado com engenhosidade e cálculos precisos. Em 1420, Florença, Itália. O visionário arquiteto e engenheiro Filippo Brunelleschi foi contratado para construir o maior domo do mundo, a cúpula de Santa Maria del Fiore. Como o domo não tinha suporte, o desafio era evitar seu desabamento.
Now, it's one thing to invent a clutch and a flywheel, and you got the donkey only going in one direction, saves a lot of time, and then you invent a crane, it brings the stuff up high. But the more important question is, I'm standing on top of this dome, and how did Brunelleschi keep this sucker from caving in?
Ele teria de manter os tijolos no lugar e ainda dar apoio à estrutura. A solução? Assentar os tijolos com uma técnica engenhosa com base em ângulos, fricção e justaposição.
Brunelleschi comes up with this invention, if you will, from Rome, which they use decoratively, but we don't know that they used it functionally, of herringbone bricks. You have a short brick here that's sort of bookended by two long bricks, and subsequently you have weight coming down, and weight coming down, and then weight coming across, and then weight coming down, and then weight coming across. The whole point of this is that a herringbone pattern will displace the weight out and down instead of just directly down where you might have collapse of your dome.
Para resolver o problema oposto, isto é, o deslizamento para fora, Brunelleschi instalou correntes em volta do domo octogonal horizontalmente.
They were going to construct these so-called catenae, or these horizontal chains that were intended to maintain the hoop stress or the lateral thrust of the dome.
5 correntes foram interligadas em intervalos regulares para suportar o domo e agir como contrafortes invisíveis. O tempo todo, Brunelleschi foi forçado a supervisionar a obra com um colega e rival, Ghiberti. Agora, com a ideia de instalar as correntes, ele viu a oportunidade de se livrar de Ghiberti.
In August of 1423, Brunelleschi called in sick. Ghiberti rather reluctantly then begins the direction of the placement of these wooden chains. And as soon as Brunelleschi heard that the process had begun, he miraculously recovers, inspects the quality of Ghiberti's work, and criticizes it publicly, saying they would have to undo everything he had done.
Ghiberti retirou-se humilhado, e Brunelleschi foi nomeado chefe vitalício de todo o projeto. A 30 de agosto de 1436, após 16 anos de construção, o maior domo de alvenaria do mundo ficou pronto. Mas a carreira de Brunelleschi apenas se iniciava. Enquanto construía o domo, ele fizera experiências sobre perspectiva e proporções matemáticas. Embora seus projetos de estruturas parecessem simples e claros, havia muitos aperfeiçoamentos relativos a linhas e espaços. Uma de suas grandes inovações foi um conceito que até hoje é utilizado na engenharia: a perspectiva de um ponto de fuga. Olhando para um batistério de 8 lados e outros prédios em volta, Brunelleschi viu que se transferisse esses objetos tridimensionais para um plano bidimensional, eles desapareceriam em um ponto finito, o ponto de fuga. O tamanho aparente de um objeto diminuía à medida que aumentava a distância do observador. Essa ideia revolucionaria a arte dos pintores e arquitetos do mundo e faria aparecer a planta do engenheiro.
What it does in architecture is change the game all the way through Frank Lloyd Wright and to Frank Gehry today. Because architecture is no more just building. It isn't figuring it out in the dirt and saying, hey, if this wall is that long, we got to make the spire that high. Now they can deduce it and put it on paper. It's no longer the builder who's in control, it's the architect.
Before Brunelleschi, most projects were based on approximate models. This would come to an end when Brunelleschi began this practice of what we call paper architecture, and that is clearly indicating what his plans were, and then begins the sort of modern tradition of architecture today.
Os novos projetos de Brunelleschi foram testados em 1442 na construção da Capela Pazzi.
Now this building behind me is the chapter house for the Church of Santa Croce, a Franciscan church. It's called the Pazzi Chapel. I'm going to talk to a man I'm a little nervous talking to. He's one of my own professors from Syracuse University, Dr. Rab Hatfield, and he's going to explain why this chapel is distinct from what Brunelleschi was doing before this. Let's go look on the inside.
Let's go see them. It's all about relationships. He's trying to figure out an arrangement of all of these pieces so they all fit together perfectly, just the way the bones all fit together in your body.
Right.
Your Renaissance architect, thanks to the invention of scientific perspective, where they learn how to represent space, and it's Brunelleschi who invents this, learn to see things in 3D, learn to imagine things in 3D.
Filippo Brunelleschi transforms all of architectural design by using Roman elements like this column and pilasters and numerical proportions, integrating them into an elegant and beautiful whole that is never overwhelmed by one of the parts. But he doesn't write it down. It's up to a young guy, the next generation, Leon Battista Alberti. This guy did everything. He wrote about architecture, archaeology, political science, religion, even wrote about horseback riding. He's a pretty good designer and architect himself. Now, everyone starts to read about Alberti, including a very powerful guy at the moment, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini. I love that name, Aeneas Silvius. So for all you guys out there like me having a little bit of a heart attack because your wife just said, honey, let's redecorate, get a load of this. Pius reads Alberti and says, you know, I'd like to do that little Roman thing for the place where I was born. What, the house? No, the whole town.
Enéas Silvio Piccolomini tornou-se o Papa Pio II em 1458. Um ano depois, voltou a atenção para sua cidade natal, Corsignano, e encomendou um estudo para ali construir uma cidade ideal.
This is the Tuscan town of Pienza. And this is my friend and a guy who taught me, Rocky Ruggiero from Syracuse University. I want to ask you first, is this the first real Renaissance town that's planned as such?
To come to this backwater town where, you know, population is a couple of 100 people, it kind of gives Pius free rein. So what he does is to create this rather imposing cathedral. And it's that first impression that you get. And then around this particular structure, he will organize all of the other various archetypes.
If this piazza is so perfectly planned with its perfect bishop's palace and its cathedral, why are these streets always crooked? I come up here, I don't know where I'm going.
This is actually done intentionally. One thing they didn't want to do was to let people know how small it was. And so they intentionally keep these streets from forming a direct axis so that you always have a corner that's sort of obstructing your view, and it makes it seem much larger than it actually is.
Quando as obras terminaram em 1464, mais de 40 prédios tinham sido construídos ou reformados. Cada um era uma importante expressão dos ideais revolucionários. A cidade como um todo espelhava o significado da própria época. Contudo, a sensação de harmonia em Pienza não durou muito. Os ideais que glorificavam o homem e o potencial humano sofreriam duro revés.
The year is 1492. Not only has Columbus discovered America, but Lorenzo the Magnificent de Medici, that great patron of the arts in Florence, is dead. But a lot of Florence is sick of the Medicis and their cronyism, and they want the Medici kids run out of town. Plus, they've been listening to the sermons of a small Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who preaches from the pulpit in the Duomo, railing against corruption in both church and state. He advocates a return to a Florentine republic and civic pride and values through piety. Savonarola warns that if Florence doesn't get its house in order, the winds of God's vengeance will blow through the city, and indeed an evil wind is ready to roll all the way through Italy in the form of Charles VIII of France, who wants to reclaim Naples in the name of his country and threatens to sack any Italian town who stands in his way.
Savonarola begins to predict an invasion of some sort. And when it finally comes, he's able to say, you see, I predicted this, I foretold it. He is able to kind of pass himself off as a prophet almost in the Old Testament mode.
A previsão do padre dominicano seria concretizada. Em 1494, Carlos VIII, rei da França, posicionou-se na fronteira toscana, pronto para marchar sobre a Itália. A Itália era um caos de pequenas repúblicas que brigavam entre si e achava-se muito vulnerável. Os construtores que haviam criado monumentos para exaltar a humanidade poriam seus projetos a serviço da guerra nessa nova etapa.
There is no such thing as a trained military engineer. And so it is that your greatest architects of the Renaissance, although sometimes they probably started out knowing nothing about it, were called upon to design the fortifications of major Italian cities.
Inovações e tecnologia avançada estariam agora a serviço do exército. A arma favorita de Carlos VIII era um potente canhão. Diante dele, as muralhas se desfaziam em pó.
The cannon became much more reliable and also able to launch a projectile that was much larger, heavier, and to launch at a further distance. And so Charles VIII brings these cannon with him over the Alps, and it becomes immediately clear that he can knock down virtually any fortification that he chooses. And this is a terrible thing. I mean, this is a crisis, right? Because all of a sudden you can't hold them off.
As muralhas medievais, altas e esbeltas, eram facilmente destruídas pela força dos novos canhões. Elas não mais ofereciam proteção. Eram tão obsoletas que não aguentavam o peso do armamento que seria usado contra os invasores.
The new cannon had strong percussive powers. You could not put a new cannon on the old medieval wall and fire it, because it would shake its own wall down.
Os engenheiros italianos projetaram muralhas mais baixas e espessas que aguentariam o armamento e resistiriam às temíveis balas de canhão.
This new wall will resist, in fact, these larger guns because it can absorb the impact of the larger projectile.
Os engenheiros também mudaram o formato das muralhas que cercavam a cidade.
Military engineers develop an angled wall.
As defensas, ou muralha em formato de estrela, mantinham os atacantes à distância, pois os ângulos escondiam os artilheiros e lhes davam ampla visão.
The cities become star-shaped, and you have the development of these large star plans with angled bastions that project from the city walls with their flanking coverage on either side. The angles create a series of faces. And the faces are very important because the different corners of the city can, as it were, protect one another.
O bastião tornou-se o novo modelo de fortificações defensivas, despertando o interesse dos comandos militares de toda a Europa. Logo, porém, a atenção se desviaria de Florença e da Toscana para um novo poder que seria redimido através de monumentos gloriosos e obras de assombrosa arquitetura. Século XV, Itália. Florença tornou-se o centro da Renascença, espalhando pelo mundo novas ideias sobre arquitetura, artes e engenharia. Mas a atenção de todos logo se voltaria para um antigo poder que retomava seu lugar com força e majestade. O foco do poder e glória voltava à cidade que havia conquistado o mundo: Roma.
In the early 1300s, there's a big beef in Rome about who exactly is Pope. So the rightful Pope supposedly goes off to France. And for the next several decades, the papacy lives in France. Now, by the 1370s, when the popes come back to Rome, Rome is a ghost town. And for the next 100 years or so, all the way through the Renaissance, each pope is successively trying to rebuild Rome. Now, in the 1490s, when the Medici are booted out of Florence, Florence becomes a republic, yeah, but they're broke. And so all these famous cats like Da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo, they split Florence because Florence is no longer happening. If you're a player, the place you want to be is Rome.
Rome had been nothing in the 14th century because the popes had moved out. But they come back in the early 15th century, and from that point on, they began gradually to reorganize the papal state.
Papa em particular desencadearia uma onda de revitalização e engenharia sem precedentes. Seu nome era Sisto V.
Sixtus and the popes who come after him feel the need to turn Rome into an important and impressive capital city, the capital of Christendom.
Sixtus V sort of took it upon himself to re-urbanize the city.
Para voltar a ser o lar da Igreja Católica, Roma precisava de uma remodelação total. A tarefa de reformar uma cidade não era pequena. Primeiro, Sisto resolveu limpar as ruas de marginais. A cidade fervilhava de criminosos e o Papa simplesmente mandou reuni-los e matá-los. O passo seguinte foi restaurar os aquedutos, um dos maiores símbolos da engenharia romana. Quando a água voltou, a população cresceu e a cidade floresceu. As estradas foram pavimentadas e as ruas alargadas. A cidade explodiu em grandes construções. Mas Sisto não estava satisfeito. Ele tinha um plano para a cidade: fazer dela um reduto de desenvolvimento e cultura através de monumentos estonteantes.
One of his particular practices was, in fact, to use the ancient Egyptian obelisks that had been brought to the city by the ancient Romans. These were military trophies that the Romans had brought back in ancient times and had erected throughout the city. We know today that there are more Egyptian obelisks in Rome than in Egypt itself. And how Sixtus used these obelisks was to, in fact, place them as urban exclamation points.
Sisto quis erguer um desses obeliscos diante de uma nova catedral, a Basílica de São Pedro. Mas havia um problema. A agulha pesava mais de 300 toneladas.
Moving the obelisk was no easy task.
Sisto passou o problema para o arquiteto e engenheiro Domênico Fontana. O plano de Domênico era simples, mas muitos o julgaram inexequível. Para proteger a agulha, ele a envolveu em uma colossal torre de madeira. Ao longo desta, mandou prender barras de ferro. A armação de madeira tinha colunas que se erguiam a mais de 30 metros. Cordas pendiam das barras de ferro de tal modo que o obelisco podia ser içado com cabrestantes. Para a operação foi chamada uma equipe de mais de 900 operários. Com 40 cabrestantes, a agulha foi erguida do chão e pousada sobre uma plataforma rolante que a levaria ao novo local. A 30 de abril de 1586, sob o olhar vigilante do Papa, teve início a incrível tarefa de transportar o obelisco.
When the men were hoisting it up, they were under command to remain silent throughout the whole process, under pain of death, if one of them in fact broke the silence.
Finalmente, após 17 dias de penoso avanço, o obelisco chegou ao novo lar, em frente da Basílica de São Pedro, onde está até hoje. A notícia da extraordinária revitalização de Roma espalhou-se pela Europa. A capital do Velho Mundo ocupava novamente o centro do palco. A era dos arquitetos, iniciada em Florença, seguia caminho em Roma e no resto da Europa.
Artists of all sorts could create such beauty, such wondrous works of art on the scale of St. Peter's Basilica, like the obelisks that were erected throughout the city of Rome, like the dome of the cathedral in the city of Florence. It gave the human significance again, and it gave us a bit of an attitude as well, that we are again the center of all things. And many people think it is with the Renaissance that modern culture actually begins.
Bella Firenze, beautiful Florence. Well, it looks pretty bella today, but believe me, in 2001, when I was sitting in a freezing apartment down there in the Arno in the middle of the dead of winter, pounding out papers until 4 o'clock in the morning on Botticelli, it didn't feel so bella. Matter of fact, I was just about an inch from getting the bella out of here, going back to my day gig in L.A. But I stayed, and I got my degree. And I keep coming back here to Florence and Siena, I don't know, to be of service, to teach a field trip or two, perhaps to sit in on a lecture by one of these brilliant professors who lives here and runs around Tuscany trying to explain how the miracles of the artists and architects of Italy in this period did so much to pull us out of that dark age and illuminate the daylight of a modern world. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Weller.